Good evening, Mayhemers. Tonight we're having a conversation with Sonia, who wants to talk with us about archetypes, dream states, and the creative process. So without further ado, Sonia is an artist and school teacher from Albuquerque, New Mexico. She utilizes a variety of mediums to create art, drawing a variety of influences, including the lives of other artists such as Frida Kahlo, who she references often in her work. She blends a variety of styles incorporating traditional religious iconography, impressionism, and surrealism. She pulls from dream states, which she refers to as fluid dreaming, to create images infused with archetypes, such as the tree of life and the separation of the divine masculine and feminine. She's spent her life exploring fear and identity, oftentimes incorporating dreams of terror. Her message reaches to us today across the span of belief, and she'll be talking about the crossroads of art and spirituality in those ways reflected in her creative style.
Hi.
Okay, hold on. Give it a second to load up. All right, there we go. All right, Sonia. Well, why don't you go ahead and get us started on this conversation about, spirituality, hidden states of consciousness, and the creative process. Our preliminary conversation was fantastic. So if you want to go ahead and get moving on that, I'm ready.
Okay. Well, I'm an artist first and foremost, and with my art, with me, it is a very meditative, therapeutic process. And when I go into painting, I always try to take it as a way to try not only to resolve anything in my mind, but to try and seek a moment of silence. And that's something I've been thinking on a lot lately is within the chaos of the mundane and everyday life, trying to find a sacred space within myself. And the way I've been trying to find it within myself is try to think on how I feel when I'm in a state of painting. And because an actual movement of painting, with it being like involved physiologically, it's a release. And so trying to think of that without painting and trying to find out where my consciousness dwells outwardly, trying to find that inside too. And so that's what the main purpose of it is for me.
Okay, yeah. So in our preliminary conversation, we talked a little bit about some of those real specific things that influence your artwork, and you mentioned sort of the archetypal symbols, dreams, and sort of how your spiritual journey and your creative process mix together. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my spiritual journey has always kind of been haphazard. Um, Grew up Protestant, and then around the time when I met you, being a personal friend of mine, really dove into looking at what the specific relationship was with the universe, God, what have you. And um, about 3 years ago, I actually started diving into what I found out my heritage was, and my dad being Mexican, you don't really hear much about like what the ancestors were before that in the Mexican world. It's like we're Mexican and that's it. And I'm like, well, there's got to be more than that. And I knew my great grandfather was from the Basque region of Spain, and as I dug deeper into trying to figure out what his story was, found out that he was part Jewish. And my last name being Luevano was actually derived from Levite, the Levite clan, Levite tribe. And finding that out, I really started reading on the Kabbalah. I'm like, okay, well, I know what I foundationally believe. I'm going to read into this since that's part of my heritage. And the more I got into that and the symbolism in the Kabbalah, tree of life and flower of life and whatnot, I started implementing that into my art as well. And this image here behind me, one of the layers is actually the flower of life, and I have the tree of life in there, and it's a story of creation. But because I try to do a lot of research in various religions, I tried to make it a very well-rounded piece. And this to me was meditative on exactly how my spirituality has developed and later on led me to Catholicism. Um, and it's a lot of people really don't know what it means when they look at it, but every once in a while there will be the random person who's like, "Oh wow, you understand about Sephra and like all that. This means like something really really deep to you." I'm like, yeah, actually. So it's led into a lot of good conversation, and that's what my art. One of my aims is to kind of make people contemplate within themselves as well to find what their consciousness is trying to tell them.
Well, certainly. So, I mean, when I look at that piece, I do understand a little bit about the Kabbalah, and I know one of the themes of that is the emanation from like an absolute godlike state or the Ein Sof to the state of world that we live in, and that's kind of that downward movement of that tree of life. But I think any viewer can look at this piece and see what's going on with the masculine and feminine energies there, and I think that there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I took part of it from a symposium, the story of the twin flames, about how man and woman were separated by the lightning from the sky because they were fallen and separated and put into turmoil and chaos and trying to find each other again. So I feel like several different religions are important to understand, to truly understand what you believe yourself. You have to kind of pick. Like, I've been accused of picking and choosing what I believe, but I don't really see it as picking and choosing. It's understanding various things and to be able to make concrete what you truly believe foundationally.
Oh, certainly. I mean, and I think one important piece of that is sort of how, in our collective unconsciousness as a species, we have these archetypes and we have these various sort of spiritual foundations and symbols that even if you choose to adhere to one religion or another, there's a certain amount of resonance from the primordial aspects of those images. And I think one thing that you mentioned to me when we were talking ahead of time was that there's sort of a process of prayer and contemplation that's going into the creation of your work. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, whether it's from my own personal life or something that I feel is speaking to me within the universe. Like, it tends to be with me. Like, if I really need to think about something, it'll come up 3 times. And um, one of my pieces that I showed you on Frida Kahlo, specifically on archetype and allegory, I call her allegorical Frida. And I've been starting to study to get into sacred art and iconography. And though I don't do typically what you think in iconography with like tempera and like laying the image flat, oil is a big no-no in that. And I'm like, well, I feel like spirituality is a lot more deep than that. I understand the whole trying to keep everything flat so you don't idolize. But with me, it's not a matter of idolizing. It's a matter of making it come forward to see what it means to you and finding that archetype. And with the allegorical Frida, you'll see not a typical halo, but it's a different shape that symbolizes what that means to you. And the reason why I chose her is in that time, I actually was at a fair trade event and somebody was arguing with me because it was at a church here in Albuquerque. And they're like, well, wasn't she a narcissist? Well, wasn't she very selfish and she only painted herself? I'm like, well, one of her best quotes is, I paint myself most often because I am most often alone. I'm the person I know best. And I feel like being able to show allegory in different compositions, you truly have to understand yourself too, and intertwining the two ideas. And she's a huge influence not only as an artist but also spiritually, because I feel like even though she was an atheist, she understood herself to find within herself her own archetype. And
Well,
also
certainly. I mean, sorry. Being an atheist certainly doesn't exclude us from being vulnerable to archetypes and drawing on this for influence and beauty and even our own sort of different sense of spirituality. When I'm
exactly.
looking at when I'm looking at this piece, one thing that strikes out to me is the orange hexagonal halo.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's what I was speaking of too. In iconography, I have a book that my fiance actually got me called The Art of Faith. And I've been diving into that here and there. I always go back to it when contemplating what I'm going to show in art. And I never knew before reading that different halos mean different things. And that one actually means allegory.
Okay.
Down there. And I was like, oh man, that's so intense. Like, and that was when I read about that and studied more on it. And that was also around the time when Frida was a lot in my mind, and um, just how she's influenced me as a woman, as a spiritual individual, as an artist, as a Hispanic, that she's influenced me more than anything. And I believe the biography on her was one of the first artist biographies I read as well. And I actually want to create a series of other archetypes who have influenced me as an artist using that hexagonal halo and that.
Nice. I like that idea a lot. Another one that sticks out to me in this series that you gave to me is the one with the dove. And the interesting thing about that piece to me, other than the very awesome use of color, by the way, is the little black structures that are surrounding everything, and to me feel like neurons. Like that's
You're
what
the
it looks
first
like to
person
me.
that got that. Like, the original intent in putting those in there were actually neurons. That's so cool. And as I was painting those, I'm like, well, these could also be veins, or just the cracks you see in a cement. And I like to leave my art up for interpretation. Like, I know what it means within me, but I try to make it big enough so that people will dive in within themselves. But the title of that piece is Hope. And that goes back into my own life. And my main aim is to try to convey beauty through darkness. And with that piece specifically, I do this in a lot of my pieces, but I try to lay in my first layer of paint, dark colors, like things that would remind you of something grotesque or vomit or something, like browns and greens. And I use lace a lot as well to specifically portray beauty. And you'll see that in that piece. I'll paint it on, let it dry, paint another layer, and rip it right off. And um, the hope being the dove, that was the final element that I put in. And that stood at a standstill before I put the dove for months. Like, I had no idea. I'm like, this is not done. What can I do? Because I knew that the neurons within myself are symbolic onto like the chaos with my own brain, and trying to come to a point of peace, to try to not worry or feel fearful and whatever may be going on. And just the constant neurons lighting and overthinking, and the veins coming into humanity. That's what I use veins to represent, our own humanity, our own fall. And with all that intertwining, I'm like, okay, I put in the nice pretty colors over with the lace to kind of downplay the darkness, not that there's still something missing. So that's why I put in the hope that through all the neurons striking, combining with our humanity, combining with the beauty, the dove is the final piece that put it all together.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm looking at it and I'm letting my eyes sort of scan around this piece, the one thing that struck me, other than the neurons, then was this sort of nebulous red cloud on the left. Okay, and when I look at that, and then I see and I follow this sort of like trails of flowers in the upper right hand corner. What I see is sort of these connections that are all coming together and sort of generating that archetype in the middle, like it's being assembled, like the dove is being put together by all of these other situations. And to me, it has a dreamlike feel. It has that sort of like when you're first falling asleep and you're in that state where you're about to slide into your dream state, and you have a lot of these abstract images and things like that, and then eventually you snap into that full blown dream. And I think when we were talking ahead of time, you were mentioning about how dreams have a very heavy impact on the way you create, and I was wondering if you could fill us in a little bit about that.
That's funny how you mentioned that kind of like that floating feeling almost in the bottom part of that painting. Because with me, dreams have always been a very important part of my psyche. Ever since I can remember, I had night terrors, and from those night terrors actually comes a lot of my paintings. And whenever I go into one of those states, it's almost like floating in nothingness, and that's you can see that a lot in my art. I always put like a like nothingness area to it because it comes from that same part of my brain. And I feel like you were speaking on consciousness before in a prior video, and through our dreams, they are signals. Some would say they're divine. Some would say they're from a lizard part of our brain somewhere, and but I feel that they are one and the same, despite whatever you may call it. And I realized that through contemplation and being aware of my own conscious state, that the more I meditate on it, that floating despair feeling goes away. And I've been really trying to practice painting a lot more. I've done more paintings the past year than I've ever have, and being able to find a state of consciousness where we are at peace and find that sacred space within ourselves is a way to kind of, I call it like fluid dreaming.
Okay. Tell me a little bit more about fluid dreaming. I want to know what that is.
So in a night terror I had a lot growing up, repeating one. It was like I finally was able to talk to myself in that dream state and be like, no, this isn't going to happen, to where I defeated this thing that was following me. And through recent meditation and reading another book that I have called The Artist's Rule, RULE, that being able to find that sacred space and to be able to not just sit in silence, but when you have like an anxiety driven thought impeding on your silence, be like, what does this mean to me? Why am I having this thought? And when I'm painting, when I'm thinking, why am I having this thought, it turns into a vein or a neuron or a nebulous or something. And being able to do that without painting is kind of like that fluid dreaming.
Okay.
Being able to control your consciousness in such a way to where you can find exactly how to overcome any anxiety that's coming up through whatever dream or nightmare or anxiety you have in your awake state. And in meditating and thinking on art and night terrors and all of this, I've found that there was an exercise I did the other day where I was meditating in silence, and it's almost like daydreaming, but having that same lucid fluid dream. And it's like having a vision and just floating over nothingness. And it's like a painting that wasn't coming out outwardly, but being able to use that to find peace within myself, like kind of the visual exercise that you did in another video. And
yes, if you don't mind if I butt in on that just for a quick second. So yeah, I want to bring that to our viewers at this point in time. In that first video where I talked about using visual space as a separate operating environment for consciousness, okay, when you look at artwork that's produced by, an artist, whether they're well known or not, what's happening is they're using that internal canvas, that internal visual space to work some of this stuff out before the hand even touches the paper. And then sometimes shit changes while you're doing it, right?
exactly.
And then you're operating in two environments at the same time. You're operating in that inner space at the same time that you're operating in physical space. And I think a lot of people who are creative probably are in touch with that to a certain point. Like they know that there's something going on inside of them that is different and that can't be touched. It's something so far behind the eyes it can't even be measured with a distance. Um, One thing that you did mention when we were talking ahead of time was sort of a prophetic feeling that you get while you're creating. Can you tell me something about that?
Um, through those dreams, like they are so incredibly vivid that it's it feels prophetic, as in the sense like this means something very important that needs to be out onto a painting. And there's one that I had actually that was very compelling. Excuse me for one moment. I'm also an artist with a child, so I need to.
Hey, we get it. Life happens, right?
um, but the prophetic part of it is get me back on track here really quick.
Well, I was just kind of wondering about, sort of that fluid, lucid dreaming part, and where that prophecy part is sort of brought out in your art or in your life, or what role that's playing for you.
Yeah. There's the dream that I was speaking of was I was actually encountered with a dragon in my dream. And this was a part in my time where I was feeling very stuck and lost and not myself. I was letting the world tell me how I needed to be, how I needed to think. And I was stuck as an artist as well with that. And when I had this dream, I turned it into a drawing, mixed media, and I call it Fear's Face. And it was prophetic within myself, showing me that I didn't need to be fearful and I just needed to be true to myself. And with, I feel like our consciousness tells us things that we don't know that we're thinking. And I knew all along what I needed to do in my own life, but with this lucid dreaming, fluid dreaming, I was able to kind of have a conversation with my own mind coming to me as a dragon. And not only is that a way to kind of lucidly alter my own state in the awake world, but it was a way to kind of put it out onto a painting and being able to be at rest. And these dreams are our body's way of telling us to meditate, to contemplate, to be able to be okay with who we are on the inside. And I feel like that's what's most important in being able to understand these things. And with having these dreams, has guided me to feel more at peace, and I haven't had them as much, and I haven't been as stressed to where my subconscious feels like it needs to bombard me with these things anymore. To be able to analyze it not only outwardly in my paintings, but to be able to find that sacred space within myself.
So Fear's Face was not just a nice piece of art you did, but it was something that created a resolution. It was something that made a milestone in your emotional state, but also in your artistic life, because it allowed you to sort of move on. Something I've been looking into an awful lot lately is grief and sorrow, and sort of how attending to those things is important to be able to sort of continue expanding. I've been reading a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which is actually this wonderful book about grief and grief ceremonies and the different sort of styles about bereavement and grieving that happen along the way. And I've found that when I was at my most artistic, I was attending to those sorrows, and they weren't just building up at the gate, so to speak, and bringing me down. And I think that's kind of what you're telling me too, is that one piece of what you're doing is attending to those various things, sorrows, and build up, but you're also turning them into something beautiful, something that's positive, and something that hopefully impacts your viewers or your consumers or your fans in a way that is resonant and meaningful to them as well. And I think that that's an interesting other piece about how collective unconsciousness works. So, I mean, I think we all have these images in our mind that we don't necessarily, we can't explain just through our own lifetime of experiences alone. They're not easy to explain by random assemblages of thoughts and neural pathways because they occur in the same way across many people. And when you're an artist, you put your own interpretation to that and try to show the world how you're experiencing it. But then my question is if there is this collective unconsciousness, every time we interpret it, does it write back over what was already there and update that as well? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is how those symbols and archetypes actually evolve as well. And I think it shows on an individual level through an artist like you, where you can see an evolution of work throughout time. But I think it also shows what symbols people gravitate to over time change. And I'm just wondering, in your mind, as you keep producing more and more images, what would be your thoughts about how that might be then going back and changing, even if a little bit of the collective psyche?
And that's true. At least the way I could take it on a personal note, even though we're talking about collective, is like through searching what I truly believe and coming into Catholicism. I was brought up Protestant, and then I was agnostic, and then thought I was atheist for a while. And I've been catching myself, the more I evaluate and the more I update what I think, as you said, the more I keep finding myself going back to Mary.
Okay.
And I was always told that was bad, that you shouldn't like pray to her or anything. And within Fear's Face, even though I was told to not believe that you should pray to her or anything to do with her, it's very strange because I looked at that and I'm like, wait a minute, there's an archetype within this. And in Revelation, you'll see that a woman in the stars is met by a dragon. And
Okay, I
so
see
that's
that.
why I kind of put those stars in there. Somewhere in my brain, I knew that, but I never like super researched into that, like growing up Protestant, because when I did this was right before I actually got into Catholicism. And it's that collective unconsciousness, like that somewhere I was being bombarded with that thought, and it helped develop how my art evolved. And through that, like I've done another piece, is my most recent piece actually, that I did of the icon of Mary in oil. And
I'm looking at it right now.
yeah, and I'm looking at it, it's on my wall right here. it's strange how that evolved within myself. Like I never understood, like I remember when I was going through the catechism and I had so many questions and I was like annoying the deacon because he's like, why are you here if you're arguing about Mary? Well, I'm not arguing, I'm trying to understand like why this is important. And what I really found within myself, it was the archetype of it. Having a spiritual mother, a spiritual guide. And that's something I struggled with, is finding like a motherly figure. And so I think somewhere in my brain, through my personal drama, I kept going back to that idea and including it into my art. And you can find other pieces that have been done through history with the dragon and the woman in the sky. And like it's just strange how that still collective unconsciousness influenced me, even though I wasn't in my front of my brain thinking on that.
For sure. I mean, when I think back to just sort of like the first two of Carl Jung's archetypes for the ego and shadow is the divine mother and the dark mother,
Right.
right? And you just kind of hit on that a little bit, that there was probably a dark mother influence somewhere in your life and you gravitated to the icon of Mary as sort of that divine mother.
Right.
Now, when I'm looking at this, the texture on the headpiece is awesome. But B, the other thing that sticks out to me with this is the symbols in the upper left and upper right corners. And so for those of us who are uninitiated, can you tell us a little bit about what those mean?
The MPOV, it's actually not an O, it's a theta, and that's derived from the Greek. And in iconography over saints, they'll put those abbreviations, and they are for whatever that saint is a patron saint for. So the MP Theta V looks like a Y, but it's a V, is actually the Mary Mother of God, is what that stands for. And so I know I'm technically not supposed to include those abbreviations if it's not done in legitimate iconography style, but I felt with it being an archetype with the way I'm doing my art, it felt important because I can't say that it's really Mary not being done in the strict way of the church, but with it being an archetype within me and in my own spiritual journey, I felt it was important to include those.
Well, for sure. And like you said earlier, as an artist, it's really hard to be how the world tells you to be, right?
Right.
Sometimes you got to be a little bit of an outlaw. Sometimes you got
Yeah.
to go out to that far outer wall to find, where you're really at. It's not always a matter of just, sticking to tradition. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of other people producing wonderful traditional religious iconography out there, and what you're doing is to me a little bit deeper and more personal than that, and it's sort of showing the convergence of those two things in your life. And so I mean, again, when I come back to thoughts like this, it's bringing me back to that point where when we're talking about consciousness, there's certain things that science can look at, there's certain things science can't look at, there's certain things that philosophy can look at, and there's certain things that philosophy absolutely fails about. There's certain things that can only be touched on with art, religion, spirituality, or personal experience. And I think that we get caught up in that sort of figuring out which one is superior or inferior to another without realizing that they're all pathways, they're all avenues, and they're all tools that we can use to sort of find our own way, right? I mean, does that make
Exactly.
sense?
Yeah, and that's one thing that's always kind of bothered me. I've had very many different types of friends in my life. I've had atheists, I've had artist friends, I had people who were super conservative, Republican, and just the whole spectrum of people in my life that have influenced me. And the one thing that's bothered me most is hearing them say, like, this is what I believe, and that's that. Or Christians bad mouthing atheists and being Bible thumpers, or atheists saying they don't like how people judge them, but then judge me. And I try to include in my art, like, okay, well, I believe this part of religion, but I also believe this part of art, and this thing that goes in philosophy, I'm going to pop that in there too because it corresponds. I'm a amateur researcher, and my house is basically a library, so I'm always trying to analyze and see how something corresponds with another to be able to put that into one composition. And that's so true with what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, and there's some people that, maybe from one staunch sort of tradition of thought or belief, and it's aberrant to them when you're able to reach across schools of thought to put together a picture. But, I think it might have been Einstein or some other preeminent thinker said something along the lines of nature doesn't have separate departments. We don't have a natural department of philosophy. Chemistry doesn't exist down the hallway. It all happens in the same place at the same time. And
That collective
um,
conscious, like you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, and it's really hard to even think about the era of time. I mean, we experience time as moving through the present, but we're moving. The past disappears and the future is coming. But when you think about that sort of piece where things are actually sort of existing in the same time, in the same space, there's that sort of role that your life and experience plays in sort of creating a story or narrative or a differentiation within that. And there's a lot of different ways we can look at that. I mean, you know, uh, linguists look at language, psychologists look at behavior and thinking, artists look for beauty and pain or whatever they're looking for. Philosophers look for order.
Right.
And it's hard to, for me, it's interesting when someone has a point of view about something and then the person that they're talking to demands some sort of evidence that is from a completely different train of thought. So like if I'm talking to you about your archetypes, right? And I say like, well, Where's the scientific proof of that? Well, I mean, it's an
It's like a
inappropriate,
scientific conversation.
yeah, it's an inappropriate question. It's an inappropriate demand for evidence that is really doesn't have much purpose other than sort of establishing some sort of, power differential within a conversation. And I think that one thing that's really good about having these talks is this sort of like egalitarian exchange of stories where we're looking at how all of these things intersect to create something that's unique and something that can't be captured in any other way than telling the story.
Yeah, and we are all created unique. Is we weren't all created to think the same way, and by thinking merely scientific or merely like an artist or as a philosopher, I feel like it makes us as individuals stagnant and we don't excel. We need to keep an open mind to be able to grow not only as humans but as spiritual beings as well.
Certainly. I mean, and we live in an age where we're all very much encouraged just to specialize and drill down on one discipline or one speciality or one, sort of train of thought so that we can make a lot of fucking money. But really, you have to find a balance in there somewhere. Even if you are specializing in one thing, it doesn't hurt to look at the rest of reality that exists outside of that, right? I mean, if we're excluding something that's happening, we're not quite here. We're in here minus whatever we're excluding.
Yeah, and I know you spoke of Descartes before too, and I found that interesting because that's always been one of my favorites. A lot of
Hmm.
people disagree, but he's been one of my favorites. And the thing that I liked about him is stating, like, always have your foundation. Like, what you know is truth within yourself and what you believe, whether about yourself or outwardly, and build upon it, but constantly reevaluate.
There's an
And
awful lot of great things that Descartes did. I mean, he basically paved the way for modern scientific method,
right,
and reductionism and things like that. The problem that he created, though, is one of language, right? So, with his mind body sort of distinction that he made, it created this sort of irreconcilable thing where if we examine one thing in really great detail, we lose the ability to reintegrate it back into the whole picture effectively. And I believe it's just an artifact of language or thought. It's not necessarily that reality itself was fucked up. It's not like we dropped the transmission or something. It's just something in the way we talk about things, and it's weird to get around that. I still haven't. I don't know if anybody else has, but
yeah, it's just a matter of not getting hung up on one little piece of information, but to be able to find your way around it to get to what you need. Oh, yeah.
all right, Sonia. So, I mean, we've actually used up a really nice amount of time. We're about 40 minutes in right now. So, is there anything that you want to leave our viewers with? Any message, any hope, any inspiration?
Um, to not overthink. It's been my own personal struggle, but to find, like I said, your sacred space and be able to find the thing that helps you get there. Yeah.
Awesome. I love that. All right. Well, thank you so very much for this.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Mayhemers, if you liked what you saw, you know what to do. Click like, subscribe, and share. We need all the help we can get. And with that, I tell you, have a good one.